Hello, everyone. Good evening or good morning, wherever you are. Um, it's a real pleasure to be here this evening and kicking off another round of dialogues for tomorrow for the Angewandte University of Applied Arts in Vienna. I'm Anab Jain. I'm a professor of design investigations, and I am totally delighted today to welcome Holly Jean Buck, researcher, educator, and postdoctoral fellow at UCLA's Institute on the Environment and Sustainability. In her groundbreaking book, After Geoengineering, Climate Tragedy, Repair and Restoration, Holly charts a possible course to a livable future. Climate restoration will require not just innovative technologies to remove carbon from the atmosphere, but social and economic transformation. The steps we must take are enormous, and they must be taken soon. Looking at industrial scale seaweed farms, the grinding of rocks to sequester carbon at the bottom of the sea, the restoration of wetlands and reforestation, Buck examines possible methods for such transformations and meets the people developing them. Both critical and utopian, speculative and realistic, After Geoengineering presents a series of possible futures. Rejecting the idea that technological solutions are some kind of easy workaround, Holly Jean Buck outlines the kind of social transformation that will be necessary to repair our relationship to the earth if we were to continue living here. It's a real honor to have with us today and explore different possible post-carbon futures. Holly, thank you so much for joining us. I was wondering if maybe we start, if you could give us a brief glimpse into some of the numerous geoengineering, or what you might put under geoengineering worlds or things that people are exploring, that you've explored in your book. And then maybe from there we could get into a conversation. Over to you.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. Very excited to speak with you today. It's always very surreal, speaking to the whole world potentially out there in my room. But I'm going to start by showing some diagrams, because geoengineering largely exists in diagrams and models, right? And it's the best way to start grappling with the scale of what some of these techniques imply. So you've probably heard about geoengineering. If you have, it's probably something like this concept, right? Cooling the earth by reflecting sunlight back into space. 1 or 2% of incoming sunlight being reflected by making clouds brighter or putting particles into the stratosphere that would reflect that fraction of sunlight, which may sound and may be like creating kind of an intentional layer of pollution. I'm not sure if it's useful to think of it that way or not. You can also think of it as a shield or a block. This is a pretty speculative idea. It's been modeled for more than a decade now, but we don't really have the research to know everything that we would need to know to try this idea. That may be what you've heard of, or you might have heard of carbon dioxide removal, methods for removing carbon from the atmosphere. You might have seen these kind of schema of this kind of menu of things you can do, right? So plant more trees, develop industrial systems for drawing the carbon out of the air and injecting it underground. And really, the idea of net zero, you might have heard of the net zero targets here in California, where I am today. We have this goal of being not just net zero, but net carbon negative by 2045. And a lot of countries have similar targets for mid-century. So that means that the net zero isn't exactly zero emissions. It's more balancing some remaining positive emissions with some negative emissions. And the negative emissions are generated by these sorts of techniques. One of them that's receiving more and more attention is direct air capture, so building machines that can extract CO2 from the air, which right now has a very large energy cost, so it would need this significant scale of renewables, even beyond what we need to power our societies. And these pictures are kind of in order from actually existing. The top is a a pilot plant in Switzerland where the CO2 that's captured is used in the nearby greenhouses. To the middle is a project that is intended to be built in West Texas, and the bottom is a visualization of what this might look like when scaled up. But the intent with these kind of systems to remove carbon is pretty massive. And so you've seen companies, though, like this is Saudi Aramco hosting this conference on the circular carbon economy, right? So could we recycle the carbon that's captured with these machines into other uses? And they have this kind of 4R schema of the future of a fossil fuel company, right? And a very large one, hinging on reducing, recycling, reusing carbon and removing it from the atmosphere. That's kind of the bet that a lot of companies will have to take. So how to do that at scale? This is what carbon reuse might look like in reality. Denver City, Texas has been injecting CO2 into the depleted oil wells to recover more oil. So not as slick. That's kind of the existing reality. So my question in this book is really, can we do better than this kind of extraction? Can we really remove carbon at scale? Because, why think about this new massive infrastructure? It's because limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, which is our global goal, relies on removing huge amounts of carbon from the atmosphere. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2018 has this special report on 1.5 degrees, and it says that the pathways that limit warming with limited or no overshoot project the use of carbon removal between 100 and 1,000 gigatons over this century. So a gigaton is 1 billion tons. It's very hard to wrap our minds around this, but that's why people are talking about actually overshooting these targets, because it's so hard to remove that much carbon. So if we can just walk you through this figure, it really encapsulates, this is actually a 2-degree scenario. You'll notice that right now current emissions are close to 50 gigatons CO2 and other greenhouse gases equivalent per year. So that needs to bend down very soon. At the end of the century, we reach this point where we're removing more carbon than is emitted. But these negative emissions, that's the green portion on the bottom, need to start to be developed right now. So if you imagine this as the carbon budget for 2 degrees, and each one of these squares is a gigaton, 1 billion tons. That's, we spend that whole budget, we reach the 2 degrees, and that's locked in, right? And so 40 to 50 per year is being spent. Pretty soon we've used up a third. By 2042, at this current level of emissions, the whole budget is used up. And it's not really an exact science. There might be errors in that budget. So this is where these goals about, rapid decarbonization by 2030 come from. They come from this principle of using up this remaining carbon budget. And every year of delay on stopping emissions counts. So I'm just going to wrap up these comments. Some removals can only be done once. So planting trees or soil carbon, those sinks will plateau after a while, which is why afforestation is a really great way to remove carbon in the near term. But after a while, those sinks are holding everything that they can hold. So there's some interesting things like this image from the Regen Network, thinking about how to develop the data infrastructure and the sensing infrastructure to really track everything that's going on in our ecosystems. A lot of energy in the Bay Area and around the world, thinking about how do we remove all this carbon. My argument is that it's not just the technology that needs creativity, it's the social organization of how society functions, really, if we want to have this massive, ambitious scale. And so, it's possible to take back some of this carbon. It's amazing. It's great that we can do that. We should go do that. But instead of being exciting about that prospect, we're often like nervous, all this new, scary technological infrastructure. And I do think that the default business as usual scenario is pretty grim. Either the technology doesn't scale up to where we need it to, or it has risks for frontline communities. But we could do this differently. And so I look forward to discussing how a bit more.
Great. Thank you, Holly. That was such a kind of good way of showing some of the insights of your book, which actually, I recommend people read the book. One of the things that really kind of stood out for me is the numbers and the scale of the problem at hand, and how complex and interconnected it is. So your piece around afforestation and the idea that European forests have accumulated 3.1 gigatons of carbon deficit sort of really struck me, because we are really we all want to believe in the idea of planting trees and want to hope that by having a lot more forests we are going to be able to make a dent. But it sounds like from what you've written that um, it is actually a very big social, economic, cultural project that will require not just planting trees, but then changing our food habits, giving up land, thinking of new ways of living, and so on. So, I mean, in your journey through your kind of essays as well as the speculative stories, could you perhaps share with us something that you feel um, some of your future scenarios where you felt like these are possibilities? Like, I know that you've tried and you worked really hard to avoid binary positions and it's either this or that. You've talked a lot about technological imagination doesn't have to be at the cost of social imagination. So yeah, pick any of your kind of speculative stories and share them with us if you don't mind.
Yeah, I've been interested and inspired by the movement around regeneration. It has some flaws, which I won't get into, but it's the one narrative about carbon removal that actually approaches a wider cultural, moral, spiritual type narrative. So basically, if you're not familiar with the term, the idea is that even just the sustainable economy is maintaining the status quo. So sustainability is not actually the goal. We should be aiming for something that's not degenerative, but an economy that's regenerative, that's actually healing ecosystems and socially dealing with things like inequality. And people who talk about this project from that framework have a different kind of sense. It's almost like some of them have gone through a semi-religious experience where they've had this awakening about how society is working and this need to do things differently. One of the challenges there is that it's really tied up with soil carbon, which I think is great on one hand because we need to transform food systems as well, but limited in terms of the carbon sequestration potential. So I guess one of the things I'm working through is how do we take that kind of energy into the industrial geologic storage space too. I think just transition is a really great framework and starting point. I think that we're also at the moment, because of the oil price crash some weeks ago, that people are rethinking how much leverage we might have over the transformation of fossil fuel companies. So it's an exciting time for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think you've been, one of the accusations around this kind of practice of geoengineering is that is this going to mean that fossil fuel companies have found a solution to keep polluting because then they know how to get rid of the carbon? And what has been your response to that?
I think that's kind of the default unless we engage with this as a social movement and a political movement, and try to push it in a different direction. And that's really the main aim of my book.
Yeah. And you have tried, haven't you? Like, you've talked a little bit about degrowth as one of the kind of tenets that is kind of like the best case scenario for carbon removal. And kind of focusing innovation efforts on innovation, on conviviality, as opposed to growth as we know it today. And so what does that future of degrowth look like?
Yeah, I think we can degrow some things in order to grow others. And so I'm interested in the language and the understanding we have around phase down or managed decline, or I'm not sure what the best way of looking at it is, but it seems like there's this general phobia of winding down any type of industry, even though if you look at any industry that exists now, it's often because some other industry wound down. And so I think we need a more generalized framework of that, not just about fossil fuels, but you can talk about single-use plastics, you can talk about industrial beef, especially from a climate standpoint. There's a number of industries besides coal that need to be phased down for public health reasons and ecosystem reasons. And so what's kind of the lexicon or the approach that we can take? I think there's some things within the degrowth space that could help us there.
Sure. And building on that you've kind of gone on to talk about reparation ecology. And that struck a chord because of everything that's happening right now as well. Like, I've spent half the day thinking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and, that your whole kind of, such a thoughtful and nuanced way talking about, how this is wrapped up in social justice movements, in race, in colonialism and imperialism. Um, so this feels like this very knotty, difficult time right now, where we are already in the middle of addressing some of these issues. Where do you see where what is the framework of reparation ecology that can help us move with some sort of care and clarity, really?
Yeah, this is something I'm grappling with, and it's been a challenge because there's the reticence within the scientific community, which I'm also trying to work in to talk
Yeah.
about it. I had a reviewer tell me once that I should take the word colonialism out of a paper because it wasn't appropriate for this type of scientific journal. And I think that there's two recent things that I would refer everybody listening to. One is the Red Nations framework on the Red Deal, specifically part 3, where they talk about healing the earth, and they talk about how the atmosphere has been colonized by first world emissions. I mean, they're up there, this huge amount of mass taking up this space, causing damage all around the world. So thinking about that as a starting point for carbon removal, what does that mean? I mean, I think it means that first world nations have the responsibility to clean it up and do that work of repair. And then there's kind of some difficulty because if these are going to be economic opportunities, we want them to be distributed all around the world, and we want people all around the world to be collaborating on how they're designing and to have a say. So I think there really has to be an international engagement, but I do think the global north needs to at least have the funding for it, if not the actual deployment, would be my guess. The second piece, which I would refer people to, is this recent article by Winona LaDuke and Deborah Cohen that came out in the South Atlantic Quarterly called Beyond Windigo Infrastructure, where they're also thinking about infrastructure and within different frameworks. So I would point people to the work going on in this space. I'm still figuring it out myself.
Yeah, I think we all are. I think what you've written really about, reparation ecology as a way to see both history and future, redistributing care, land, and work so that everyone has a chance to contribute to the improvement of their lives and to that of ecology around them, can undo the violence of abstraction that capitalism makes us perform every day. And I kind of sense this thread of kind of quiet activism throughout your book. Like there is somewhere right in the beginning, you say, we, the workers and the voters, will have to decide to force the removal of carbon from the atmosphere. And so what would, I mean, I don't want to ask a very simple question like what can we do, because that is not really, there isn't really a simple answer. But what were you thinking when you were, what have your thoughts been around this?
Yeah, I mean, my thought on that is really just informed by the scale of the problem. I don't think there's any existing movement or institution that can, transfer this huge amount of mass within a capitalist framework, frankly. So I think that there's a few things we can do. We can link carbon removal with the managed phase down of fossil fuels via supply side policies that integrate carbon removal with production. So for example, a carbon take back requirement, some people are discussing that, where companies are required to take back carbon that they produce. Production quotas for fossil fuels linked to certificates of carbon removal obligations. There's been some discussion of that, I think, integrating carbon removal with just transition, and also making the remaining emissions or the residual emissions more of a political matter, because how much emissions will still be happening that needs to be balanced by these negative emissions has so far been a very technical discussion. It could be a political one as well. Policies to ensure that the public has ownership and return on investment from carbon removal projects. All of these things could be political demands that organizations in the climate space could take up as part of their broader demands. I mean, that's what I hope to see. And so for every individual, if you are part of a climate movement, bring up these types of things for discussions within your organization, I think is the first step.
Brilliant. I mean, one way that I imagine us, or like, I'm talking about the Angewandte and our students, the way they could probably play a role is through their projects of social imagination. And this is something we talk about throughout, that we as artists, designers, makers, craftspeople, working with material and imagination also as a material. You've talked about like, what does a post net zero future look like and feel like to live in, and that's something that that's something we do. My students do. People, students in the Angewandte are constantly thought of. The project of nurturing imagination is very strong. Uh, there seems to be a bit of a disconnect between the kind of um, what scientists might label as whimsy, the instruments of and tools of imagination that we use, and how can we foreground these practices for the scientific community.
Well, I'm really excited about the potential of people I've been talking to since writing this book in architecture and design and other fields, because they have this amazing communicative tool set. And so, it's a challenge to see these graphs, understand what they imply, and then try to translate that into a vision with emotion or sensibility, or that's vivid in some way. And I used fiction in my book because it's the only medium that I have on hand, but there's so much out there that people can work up to. And I think visualizations are incredibly powerful. I think that, so one part is visualizing the kind of landscape transformation and the infrastructure, but the other part is envisioning the society that makes that possible, and then the combination of those.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in terms of thinking about imagining that, I think some of the things that you have thought about around, say we go, we stop emitting stop all emissions today, it will still take us 10 years, presumably, to kind of stay in that position before we go into the negative. Have you kind of even to stop, like, what is the extent of change?
I mean, we've really gone so far. It's I wrote about coral reefs a bit in the book because that's kind of one of the clearest examples of an ecosystem that's probably doomed, and trying to reckon with that. And it comes back to, in some ways, to the discussion about reparation ecology. You have to recognize and like account for and hold in mind, the tragedy that's happened and the who was responsible and why and all of that. I think that in our society, we're trying to do that a little bit right now. We're starting to with slavery and structural racism and colonialism, but it's just so far from where we need to be to and then ecosystem destruction, it's of a piece, right? And so if we get to that point where we can understand and face it, I'm hopeful for at least limiting that to 3 or 4 degrees. But I think that getting back to your question, I think that one thing we can start doing is thinking more about how carbon removal intersects with adaptation, because we know that there's going to be a lot of adaptation that often gets left out of these discussions about emissions and mitigation and so forth, as the funding and the social infrastructure for adaptation as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so what does that, what in terms of just a little, what does the infrastructure of such adaptation look like, or what does it need to be in one example or something of that kind?
Yeah, I think it really informs how we think about natural climate solutions, right? Ecosystem-based carbon sequestration, and that pushes us towards agroforestry, things that have, benefits for communities rather than plantation models, for example. I think that thinking about, blue carbon, wetland restoration, types of infrastructure for coastal erosion and storms and so forth. I think that it also helps us think about kind of the economic benefits to the communities, because so much of adaptive capacity is wrapped up with economics and livelihoods and so forth. So it can thinking about it from an adaptation standpoint can help push us, I think, towards centering the communities and the benefits and the drawbacks more into the picture, rather than just evaluating projects on their carbon sequestration potential alone.
Yeah. And there's something building on that I think we probably one last question before we were running out of time. But I wanted to, you're talking about reparation ecology, and there's something that struck to me was, like an oil company, a fossil fuel company might only make 7% of the profit of, like, we are all tied into the profits of that company in one way or the other. So then the reparation project is enormous, and if we take that into account, I don't know if that's much of a question, as in just like, again, the scale of not just the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, but what we need to do as a social and political project is a bit mind-boggling.
It is mind-boggling, but it really speaks to how it needs to be a cultural value that's widely understood. So just as many of our societies worked really hard in the 18 and 1900s with the sanitary movement to clean up waste for public health reasons. And it was a movement that happened because of this demand from people. So could we see something similar today where people are committed to this as a goal? I hope so.
Well, that's a lovely or a very hopeful thought to leave everyone with. I think we are coming to an end. I don't know if there are questions, but I'm just looking at the chat. Like, I've got the YouTube window open and the Zoom window and the Zoom chat, and somehow it'll all be hopefully smooth and running fine. Any last thoughts or comments before we end today's dialogue?
Well, I know there was a lot of a lot of information and ideas, and so I would invite anybody who's watching, please feel free to email me if there was a point that wasn't clear around the technology or whatever.
Brilliant.
And thank you for listening and engaging and taking your time, especially in an era of Zoom fatigue, to think about that.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks everyone who managed to join us despite all the different time zones. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Holly, so much for your time.
Thank you.
And take care. See you. Bye.